Hi everyone, and welcome to the final installment of this gouache series. In this last video we will be painting a human eye. This demo will be focusing on how gouache, although a wonderful medium for on-the-go, fast-paced painting, is also really great for more full-fledged illustrations and more finished pieces. Before we jump into the painting itself, here's a quick overview of the supplies I will be using for this piece. I will be painting on a small piece of Series 400 Strathmore mixed media paper taped to a board. As per my landscape painting, I will be using the paints I picked from my basic kit in video 1, but I will add my 2 reds to the palette too, so that we effectively have all our paints available to us this time. I poured them all out onto my ceramic palette and I will walk you through each mix while I paint. I have 2 jars of water with me, one for washing my brush and one to mix water into my paint, which is a pretty standard practice if you want to avoid your paints getting too muddy, and I have a wad of tissue paper to dry my brush on. For the brushes, I am going to use 2 of my Princeton Velvet Touch brushes. My main one, which I will be using to paint most of this piece, will be the 1/4 inch angle shader, and I will also use a number 2 round pointed brush for details and lashes and hair. Before we jump into the painting, let's quickly review the reference we'll be using. So as per our landscape last week, the first thing we want to do is determine our value distribution. Where are our darkest darks and our brightest highlights? The brightest spot on our piece is obviously the highlight in the eye right here. So we will be using some of our pure white for that, which will only need to happen towards the end of the painting. As opposed to our landscape though, no area in this reference is radiating light, so there is less of a need to reserve whites like we did in that painting previously. As opposed to our landscape from last week, no area in this reference is radiating light, so there is less of a need to reserve the whites. It will be a lot easier to add our highlights over our painting at the end. The darkest part of this image is the pupil. So we will make sure to reserve our black paint for that area and stray away from using pure black anywhere else, as that would undermine the depth that we need to represent in the pupil because it's a hole, obviously. Another important thing to do when using a skin tone reference is figuring out the different areas of colour and the level of warmth. I chose an eye for this exercise because the eye area of the face includes a good variety of skin tones and has interesting volumes and colours all close to each other. In this piece there are a few different colour variants. So the area under the eye has a lot of pink. So all here it's very pink. The skin surrounding the eye has a lot of yellow, so everywhere around here is a lot less pink than here and has a lot more yellow and browns in it. And finally, the area between the eye and the nose has some blue and purple. So this here has a lot more blue and purple than anywhere else on the skin. Figuring out this colour distribution can help us stray away from using too much of those colours in other areas, in the same way that determining the darkest darks in our value range can help us assign where our darkest colours should and should not go. Okay, so now let's get to some painting. I am going to use the same palette I used for the landscape painting, so some of my colours have dried a little, but I sprayed them with some water and they have now softened up. Reactivated colours, although they do work well with gouache, are generally more difficult to use to achieve a highly opaque finish, so I will also top up some of the colours I know I will be using more of with some fresh paint. I particularly want to top up my white, as that is a very useful colour when painting skin tones. I am also going to use some red in this painting, so I need to pour some of my 2 red colours into my palette, our Cadmium Red Hue and Alizarin Crimson Hue. Reds are powerful colours, usually quite pigmented, so I won't be needing a lot of either, so I'm only going to drop in a very small amount. Colour mixing will be a little bit trickier with this painting, but I will walk you through each colour I use and why, and you can refer to the downloadable worksheet that goes with this video if you would like a list of each colour mix. So we are going to start by painting a base skin tone by using some of our titanium white and raw sienna. As you can see, I am only very briefly dipping my brush into my raw sienna, as I am only looking to tint my white, and it is very easy to go quickly overboard with adding any colour to white, so I'm taking it slow and building my colour up cautiously. I use even more caution when it comes to adding red to my mix. I'm using my warm red, my cadmium red, to add a hint of warmth to my mix. Using a warm red for this is better than the cool red, as cool reds have more pink and purple in them and can make skin look more synthetic or made up with makeup, whereas a cool red has more orangey undertones, which works best to achieve a natural looking skin tone. Like Caucasian skin has a lot of red in it, but isn't fully pink. It's more of a warm ochre hinting at orange, and in our picture in particular it is almost a very light brown, so that is what we are looking to achieve. If I feel like I'm adding too much red, I counterbalance it with some more raw sienna and vice versa. A quick tip when mixing colours with white. When you're putting a mix together but feel like you are going too dark, mix a tiny amount of your mix with a new batch of white. Darkening white is a lot easier than lightening a dark mix, and it will require a lot less paint. When I first went to apply my mix to my paper, I realised it was a little too dark for my liking, and you could see how much darker it appeared on the paper versus the palette. To remedy to that, I picked up some fresh white and applied it to my still wet first layer, opaquely, quite literally mixing my white into my skin tone right onto the paper. I will often do that with skin tones. I create a basic mix, apply it to my paper, and then I apply a lighter or darker version of that colour to my still wet layer to create my colour variations right onto my paper. This basically means I am mixing and blending directly onto my painting surface. It requires your mixes to be fairly thick and opaque in order for them to mix without becoming muddy or streaky, but if done right, it can be really effective. I am not applying my mix evenly all over my piece, as I don't want there to be too much paint in areas I know I want to add different colours. I am making sure not to add more than one layer of paint to those sections. This will make my time a lot easier when it comes to adding layers of pink and blue to the right side of the eye, for example. I won't have to fight my previous layers to avoid them reactivating and messing up my colour. I am only applying my base skin tone to the areas that are mostly that colour already on my reference and will need little to no tweaking apart from maybe adding shadows. An exception to that, however, is the eyebrow area, since the eyebrow hairs weren't required to be blended in and will be painting using quick, small opaque strokes, meaning I won't need to brush the area very much when painting them. Therefore, I went ahead and added my skin tone colour there a bit more thickly to make sure that some of the skin comes through the eyebrow hairs when we get to painting them. When painting my skin base, I am adding almost no water to my brush and only dipping the tip of it into my water every so often to avoid my paint drying out. Adding too much water to my brush would make my paint slide all over my paper and will make it look a lot more streaky and muddy. It can be tempting to add more water to your brush to help with blending, but I find that it actually hinders the process more than anything. When using gouache, blending with more paint instead of water is less likely to reactivate and muddy your colour. Personally, in this painting, I am not going to be overly blending my strokes, as I find that some apparent brush strokes can make a painting look more dynamic and skin tones look more organic, so I am putting together a fairly thick and opaque mix and leaving my brush stroke fairly apparent. Once I've done the rough layer of skin tone, I wait until my colours are dry so I can start refining without messing everything up. Waiting for my colour to dry also allows me to see what values I end up with, since dark colours tend to dry lighter and lighter colours tend to dry darker. Consequently, areas of my painting that seemed quite light when wet have now dried darker than I want them, so I'm going back in with some ochre tinted white to lighten them up. Remember not to use your pure white quite yet, as we're reserving that for our brightest highlight. White is easily dulled down though, so the tiniest amount of colour added to it will immediately turn its brightness down a notch, which is what I'm doing here. Next, we are going to start applying our shadows. For that, I am going to mix up a warm brown, using my light skin tone as a base, and adding in some raw umber, plus a tiny bit of Alizarin Crimson to warm it up. I apply that mix on my dried painting, making sure to not apply too many strokes so as not to reactivate my lighter layers too much. If I want to enhance the darkness of my shadow mix, I add a little bit of Payne's grey to it, and to lighten it, I simply mix it in with some fresh white. I then put together a warmer transition colour using my shadow mix plus some of my light skin tone and some cadmium red. I tweaked my transition mix as I went, adding more white or more shadow colour depending on whether I wanted to lighten or darken it, and I'm going to apply it to all the areas that are more in shadow, which is pretty much all around the eyelids. My paint is very thick and opaque, and I make sure to only add water when I want to reactivate the underlayer a little more to blend, and even then I only use the tiniest amount of water on the tip of my brush. We have to work very carefully during this step, making sure that we don't reactivate our previous layers too much. It has to be just enough that we can blend, but not enough that our old layers overtake our newer layers and create streaks. Don't worry if your shadows are looking very intense at this point, we will be layering on top of them to soften and shape them as we go along. Now let's start adding some of that pink tone around the eye. I thought that the eye in our reference looked almost a little bruised because the pink underlining the eye was so dark, so I lightened it for the purpose of our painting to make it look less intense and more luminous. For this mix, I'm going to use some white, slightly tinted with a bit of our skin tone to tone the brightness of it down, and I'm going to mix in some cadmium red to create a pastel pink. I want my pink to be a little patchy to make it look more organic and more like a flush rather than makeup, so I'm not mixing my pink tone thoroughly and I'm leaving it somewhat uneven. I make sure to vary the intensity of my pink as I paint, keeping the brighter pink to the inner corner of the eye and the underline of the lower eyelid. I occasionally retouch my lower eyelid crease shadow if I feel like it is getting too covered up with my lighter pink colour. After I have once again waited for my painting to completely dry, I'm going to go in with a dark brown mix made up of raw umber and burnt sienna, and I'm going to draw on the upper lid crease again, as well as block in my brow. I find angled brushes to be great to paint coarse hair, as it's easy to use either the blade or tip of it to create thin, quick strokes. There is no need to paint each hair though, and to achieve the illusion of hair in the thick part of the eyebrow, I try to vary my colour mix a little, going in with a lighter colour every so often to create the illusion of hairs being on top of each other, and using a deeper brown to put in darker areas at the base of the brow where most of the shadow would be. When working opaquely with gouache, it's important to be decisive and put down strokes confidently and resist the urge to go back and work your stroke in further, as that will just heighten the likelihood of you messing up your painting by reactivating all your layers. As I go along, I gradually build up my shadows with various variation on my brown shadow mix, adding white to lighten it and create various transition tones. As always, I try to be decisive when I paint my strokes, and I avoid rubbing my paint in too much. I also start outlining the upper lid and the iris with a dark brown, darkened even further with Payne's grey. It's now time to add some of that blue tone into our piece. The skin around our eyes is very thin and has a lot of redness as we saw, but also some blue due to the underlying veins and vessels running under the skin. This varies according to skin tones obviously, but is very apparent in our reference since our subject has very light Caucasian skin. The blue tint is mostly on the inside of the nose, near the inner corner of the eye, as well as slightly under it. It's very light and almost imperceptible, but adding it to your painting will emphasize the look of thin, translucent skin and will make your eye look a lot more realistic. To create our blue color, I'm going to mix some of our cool phthalo blue with our light brown transition color. Be careful with blue as it's even more intense than red, and a little goes a long way. I want only a hint of blue in our mix, and I even go as far as diluting it with more water to make it a little more watery than our mix is so far, so that my strokes lightly reactivate my layers and my blue blends in easily. I quickly want to show you what happens if you don't wait until your paints are properly dry to layer over them, and when you also use a little too much water. Here I made the mistake of being impatient and I lifted all my still wet shadow colour to reveal the skin tone underneath. I didn't wait long enough and now I have to patch it and wait until it's all dry enough to keep working on that spot. Next, I add a tiny amount of yellow tinted white to the inner corner of the eye, and then I paint in the white of the eyes. The white of our eyes isn't actually very white, especially when you factor in the shadow cast by the eyelashes and upper lid. It often has a bluish greyish tint to it and is darker right under the upper eyelid. The inner corner of the eye is very pink and very shiny, and so is the edge of the lower eyelid, so I add tiny accents of dark pink in those areas. I also start adding small white accents every here and there. I don't wash my brush for this, so my white is slightly tinted, but still light enough that it stands out and makes the corner of the eye shinier. At this point in the painting, there is a lot of tweaking and back and forth. I jump from one area to the other to make small incremental changes, using mostly the mixes already on my palette. We have pretty much mixed all the colours we will be using for this piece already, so now it's a matter of tweaking what we have and carefully layering our paint to create dimension and detail. I keep my mixes fairly opaque and my strokes concise, as there is now a lot of layers of paint on our paper and it's important to be careful and only add what is necessary. Next, let's work a little on the iris. The iris of the eye is made up of a lot of different colours laid out in a sort of star pattern around the pupil, so I'm going to apply each stroke in a circular motion around the pupil. At this point, I have painted the pupil a pure black and I have used Payne's grey around the iris. The eye in our reference is blue and green, so I start off with a few strokes of diluted Payne's grey and then I mix a rough green with cadmium yellow and ultramarine blue and apply that over my blue strokes. I am not worrying too much about my colours mixing together, as that will only help to make it look more translucent and natural. I also add a few accents of light blue to create more depth, avoiding the top of the iris, where the shadow from the lid creates a darker area. Once my colours are dry, I go in with a fresh brush and some pure white and add our bright highlight. After I added the highlight, I realized the white of the eye was still too bright and didn't allow the light reflection on the iris to really shine, so I went in with a light blue-grey mix and toned it down a little, blending it slightly with water to mix it in with the previous layer underneath. To emphasize the roundness of the eyeball, I also added a tiny bit of that blue-grey mix to the bottom of the eye. I also added a few tiny touches of pink with some blue in it to tone down its vibrancy to both corners of the eye, where tiny blood vessels lend the white more colour. Then, using a burnt sienna mix with a tiny amount of red mixed in, I lightly lined the lower eyelid. And after that, once again, it's tweaking time, where I add tiny details here and there. The eyebrow needed more and darker hair, and I also added more stray hairs, using a flicking motion with my wrist to taper the end of each hair off. I also go back to the skin surrounding the eye, adding strokes of opaque, slightly darker skin tone in a circular motion around the eye itself to add more interest to the piece and frame the eye better and draw attention to it. The shadows under the eye bag and right under the brow are quite cool, almost grey, so I carefully use a light mix of brown and the tiniest amount of cool blue to add a little more shadow in those areas. Notice once again how my strokes are decisive and how I don't work my surface. I also don't linger and take too long to draw my strokes, as the longer I stay on one spot, the more likely the water is to seep into the earlier layers and reactivate them. I continue working that way with single, quick and light strokes, emphasizing shadows and highlights until I'm satisfied and feel like working things further would be too difficult, as there is too much paint on the paper and too much of a risk of messing things up irrevocably. Once I am sure I am happy with how my upper lid and brow look, I can start adding eyelashes. It's important to be happy with those areas first, since once we add tiny dark strokes on top, we won't be able to change them anymore. To draw the eyelashes, I switched to a thin, round, pointed brush and I used some of my darkest brown mix, a combination of raw umber and Payne's grey. It might be tempting to paint the eyelashes and eyebrow hairs the same black as the pupil, but the pupil is a whole, whereas the hairs and lashes are not, so they shouldn't be as dark as a whole is. Keep your black for the pupil and try to use a dark brown mix for the hairs. Dark colours in gouache might look the same when wet, but anything that isn't black will dry lighter than black. So long as you don't use pure black, any mix you put together, no matter how dark, is likely to be lighter than black once dry. I rotated my canvas so that I could make sure that I could use the movement of my wrist to comfortably taper the end of my stroke out when drawing the lashes. Make sure you look at your reference to see how eyelashes grow. On the upper lid they are slightly curved and overlap the eyeball a little, so don't be afraid to paint over your eye a tiny bit. The lashes on the lower lid are shorter and there are fewer of them. They look like they are a little further from the eyeball because we can see the lip of the lower lid. All lashes grow in triangular clumps overlapping each other and are not evenly spaced apart. I apologize if my hand is in the way of the camera for some of the strokes, but I'm using the thin point of my brush to draw the lashes, and it means holding my brush vertically above my paper. My paint is very opaque and my strokes are quite quick. I do want to say, however, that the time-lapse can be deceptive as to how quickly I work. I needed to keep it fast for the format of the video, but in reality I am taking my time with all my strokes, thinking them through and making sure I have them planned out properly. I pause a lot, I think, and I make sure I don't jump into things too quickly. Take your time and paint at the speed that feels right for you. This is about learning about gouache, about painting, and about your own process, so do it at your own pace. We are approaching the end of the painting, so most of my next steps are going to be emphasizing shadows that once again dried lighter than I want them, adding small highlights and generally assessing what needs to be tweaked and either enhanced or toned down. I want the inner corner of the eye to be lighter, so I add some white there. I punch up the pinks in the tear duct, I add some light purple tones and pinks to the under eye, and I add the shadow cast by the lashes onto the eyeball with a few light grey strokes. One of my last steps is to add some freckles to the skin to add interest and depth, as well as a few light coloured strokes to mimic the subtle wrinkles under the eye. I keep it light so as not to make the eye look old. Once again, as I said when we painted the landscape, it's easy to want to tweak forever. There always seems to be something that can be done to make the painting better, but with gouache it's so easy to overwork a piece that knowing when to stop is key, and I was starting to struggle with my layers reactivating very easily and my strokes muddying each other, so it was time to stop. And we are done! Thank you very much for joining me for this 4-part gouache course. I hope it was useful and interesting and that you will enjoy experimenting with this really wonderful medium. Gouache is a fantastic paint and it's very versatile. You can use it in a translucent way similar to watercolor, but it's also brilliant to work with opaquely and really shines that way. It can be a tricky learning curve like a lot of things, but the key is to work concisely, be short enough of your strokes that you don't need to overwork them, and resist the urge to keep adding and fixing. I strongly recommend it as a medium in its own right, but also as a practice medium to experiment and to learn about painting quickly and more confidently. Once again, thank you so much for being a part of this workshop, and I look forward to seeing the work you create from it. Take care everyone, and I'll see you around. Bye!